Um, I just want to begin this session. It's 2 minutes past the hour. I want to begin this session now. Thank you, colleagues, for joining. A good morning, a good afternoon, and maybe a good evening. Who knows? Perhaps colleagues are joining from Asia or Australia. On behalf of the Africa Labor Research and Education Institute, and ALREI is an education and research institute of ITUC-AFRICA, and in collaboration with our steadfast partners at the Friedrich Ebert Stephen FES Geneva office, I warmly welcome you to this important gathering under the Trade Union Trade Talks, which we call the TUTT series. Just checking, Comrade Tiri, if we are recording. If not, please hit the recording button. But I think I see recording. Colleagues, why the TUTT series? The world of trade is moving faster than ever. Digitalization, geopolitical shifts, food insecurity, and changing tariff regimes. And issues and connections with the Africa Continental Free Trade Area on the continent of Africa. Yet, one truth remains. If workers are left out of trade policy, development will not be just sustainable or inclusive. The TUTT series was created to bridge the knowledge gap between the negotiating table and the factory floor, to equip trade unions with the tools, the evidence, the information, the networks even, that are needed to influence trade policy in favor of what? Decent work, in favor of what? Gender equity, in favor of what? Social justice, in favor of Africa's economic sovereignty. Across the sessions, we usually aim to build our own capacity, promote evidence-based advocacy, and connect regional actors such as researchers, policymakers, unionists through this shared knowledge sharing platform. And ultimately, we hope that when we do this, we can do our little bit by advancing knowledge in the field of trade forward. So I want to thank again our close partners, FES Geneva office, for helping to put this together, this TUTT series together, and also our solidarity partners, SASC and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland, for that initiative of making sure that trade unions are in the middle of trade talks. Today's session is focused on WTO reform after Yaoundé, implications for Africa's, or African workers. And the WTO Ministerial just ended, and I read the summary on the 30th of March from the chairperson and from the Director General. This discussion is situated within an evolving global trade architecture and ongoing debates on WTO reform, particularly following recent engagements in Yaoundé. So this session is going to provide us an opportunity to critically reflect on how these reforms would shape Africa's position in global trade, if at all, and more importantly, their implications for workers across the continent. So this session, we hope to advance those discussions and see the role of developing countries in shaping global trade governance, if we can at all. With me today, my host is Vahini Naidu. She has a very tall CV, I must add, but I'll try and summarize it just ahead of our quick Q&A. So Vahini is a program coordinator of the Trade for Development Program of the South Center, an intergovernmental organization that supports developing countries in advancing their interests in global economic governance. She is an experienced lawyer, trade negotiator, and former diplomat, providing legal and policy advice to developing countries and their groupings in international trade negotiations, both in Geneva and in different nations. Her work spans trade law and development with a focus on systemic cross-cutting policy issues. She has contributed extensively to the work on WTO reform, industrial policy, fisheries subsidies, agriculture, services, and digital trade, and what have you. But prior to joining the South Center, she served in South Africa's Department of Trade and Industry, where she was involved in negotiations under SADC, the Tripartite Free Trade Agreement, the Africa Continental Free Trade Area itself, and also the WTO. She later represented South Africa at the WTO in Geneva, coordinating the African Group on Services and E-commerce and contributing to discussions on trade, environment, and development. So if you are thinking, if we have the right person, oh yes, we do. She is the person to help us disintegrate this topic. And so, Vahini, welcome. Let me start with a very soft question to help us with an easy landing later. And the soft question is, the WTO Ministerial just ended in Yaoundé, Cameroon. They were there to talk about WTO reforms. I have read a lot of the outcome documents, including the chair's paper and the Director General's briefs. Tell us what happened in Yaoundé. Give us a fair view of what happened, what transpired there. What are your takeaways as a trade negotiator for Africa?
Okay, that's a lot. Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, or good evening. It's a pleasure to join you this afternoon, and thank you so much to the organizers as well for this invitation. So to be honest, I'm still dealing with my own reflections coming out of the ministerial conference. It was in some ways very much expected, but I think the way things had unraveled at the conference were not as expected, at least in terms of the countries who eventually were seen to be holding a very strong line when it came down to members agreeing to the moratorium on customs duties on electronic commerce, for instance. But really, if I had to give you one word, I would say that we had already had a very realistic sense of what was going to happen at the ministerial conference before we even left for Yaoundé. And when most of us were already on the flight, just getting to Yaoundé, so we had arrived in Douala and everybody had put on their phones, and we had all received the US submission, which was their follow-up submission to the WTO reform process. And interestingly, they had tabled their paper in the WTO General Council and not the ministerial conference. So already we were getting a sense that the WTO reform agenda at the ministerial conference itself was going to be very difficult to see some kind of consensus around it. And that the US had also spelled out quite explicitly that they were expecting that there would be a permanent moratorium on on the customs duties on electronic transmissions. So in some ways things had shifted a little bit. And what had basically unraveled at the conference was a mix of some chaos, a lot of politics. There were some high expectations. But to be frank, I think having followed so many of these processes over the last several months leading to the conference, a lot was very much expected. So just talking very in plain terms, just to give you a sense, you would have seen some reports where they talk about the conference kind of being a success, or that we have left the conference with some guidance in terms of the way forward. But in all honesty and reflection, I don't believe that this is very accurate. So the ministerial conference had adopted only three decisions. The first one was a work program on small economies. Then there was a ministerial decision on special and differential treatment, and this focused primarily on two WTO agreements, which is the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement and the technical barriers to trade agreement. And these were really merely just political decisions. The small economies one had mandated some work that the WTO should conduct, but there wasn't anything materially substantive that had come out of it. And finally, the last decision was a ministerial decision basically on fisheries subsidies, where they were acknowledging that work has been undertaken, that we kind of celebrate the entry into force of the first agreement, the agreement on fisheries subsidies, and basically just giving some political guidance that we will continue negotiations towards completing and finalizing the phase two negotiations of fisheries subsidies. I think what was more telling was pretty much what was deferred, what had lapsed, and what had basically collapsed at the ministerial. So I mentioned the e-commerce moratorium. So this is traditionally seen or kind of taken together in a negotiating sense with the TRIPS non-violation and situation complaints moratorium. So both of these had lapsed at the ministerial conference. Then the big ticket item, which was WTO reform, unfortunately, there was no consensus outcome on it, and that work has been deferred to Geneva. And they've just announced that they're going to be having the big General Council meeting on the 6th and 7th of May. So I imagine that members are going to be spending the next couple of weeks trying to finalize or trying to negotiate what that so-called package is going to look like. And just to also mention that the chair of the conference, the Minister of Trade of Cameroon, had also indicated that whatever is now taken to Geneva is going to be called the Yaoundé package. And finally, I think it's also very, very important to point out that agriculture, which had faced a number of obstacles in Geneva before we even left for the conference, did not have any consensus outcome. So there was absolutely no outcome. And I guess for all intents and purposes, we could say that agriculture had collapsed. And so there is no placeholder for agriculture to even have some kind of way forward in this post MC14 process as part of the Yaoundé package. So right now we're looking at the two moratoriums or moratoria, the TRIPS and the e-commerce. We're looking at the LDC package, and we're looking at WTO reform.
Wow. I thought I was going to hear something new. But like you said, Vahini, it's an old rhetoric. And where do we go from here, staying on the subject of WTO reform? I mean, we've seen what America is up to now with President Donald Trump. There is some form of increased unilateralism. There's some renewed protectionism. There is some continuing, some commentators say, weakening of WTO dispute settlement system. There's some pressure on developing countries to reduce the policy space, some deregulation that is being forced on the developing countries that need support, and some fragmentation, if you like, of the global trading system. So from where you sit, when we are hearing WTO reform and there was even no consensus, as you have just mentioned, and it's being tabled back to General Council in Geneva, how should this reform look like with what we see in the world today? And it is no news of the interlinkages of the global supply chains. Look at what is happening to the price of oil today with the war, the US-Israel war in Iran. So what is this reform that we are talking about, and what should we actually expect?
So I think in some respects, what we're seeing happening right now is kind of a term that they've been using for the last couple of years, known as reform by doing. So, in as much as the ministerial conference itself, did not come up with any kind of substantive conclusions or positive outcomes, there have been some developments that are directly related to this ongoing WTO reform agenda. So, for instance, at the conference itself, two plurilateral, two plurilateral declarations were issued outside the consensus framework. So, 51 members had launched the Agreement on Electronic Commerce through interim arrangements. And the highly anticipated agreement, which proponents have uh, tabled for incorporation into the WTO legal framework, is the Investment Facilitation for Development Agreement, in which 129 members have reaffirmed their commitment to. This did not get the consensus that was needed. And so a declaration was basically issued that countries are going to proceed with their interim arrangements to continue working towards these implementing the provisions of these outcomes in these negotiations. But I think overall, and this is from all sides, it's from the US and kind of the disruptions that have caused that have been kind of stirring for many, many months now, coupled with the war and the energy crisis and all of that, was that the dominant context was, in fact, definitely set by the United States, because they had not only tabled what I would say was a maximalist reform paper 3 days before the conference had opened, but it's what they are also proposing. So they're proposing to restructure special and differential treatment eligibility for developing countries. We saw that the LDC package, in which there were very minimal outcomes that the LDC group were advocating for, did not get the consensus that was needed. There's the big question about the foundational issues. So you know that the US is now challenging non-discrimination, particularly the MFN, the most favored nation principle. So there have been conversations around that as part of the WTO reform discussions. But I think more importantly, and this is where I had started about the outcomes of the plurilateral, these plurilateral declarations that had come out by a subset of countries, is this question around what are we going to do in the WTO regarding the bigger question mark around consensus decision making versus, I think, to some extent, what we may now see to be a fragmentation of the system through plurilateral arrangements and agreements. So, there have been multiple conversations that have taken place both within the WTO reform discussions, but also out of that context in terms of what do we want the future of the WTO to look like. And it seems now that, there's also the takeaway report that has come out
Mm,
from the minister facilitators on WTO reform. And this
mm,
was a number of breakout sessions that were conducted with the ministers in, I think, about 6 different breakout sessions over 4 different themes. And it's
mm,
basically showing that this model has some support, but also unease, particularly from small and vulnerable economies.
mm,
And I think one of the countries or one of the groupings had also made reference to a two-speed WTO. So there is definitely some concerns around, are we now looking at a rules-based framework, or are we
mm,
looking at more of a coalition-based, interest-based uh, framework in the WTO? And
mm,
I think part and parcel of this conversation, and you had mentioned it already, is the dysfunctional dispute settlement system. And the big question here is that if we do move away from this rules-based system, are we now entering this realm where it is only going to be might is right, or this kind of power-based system? So these conversations are taking place, but unfortunately, there's really no consensus around what the challenges are, and there's no consensus around what the solutions are. Now, in addition to this, I think one of the biggest concerns, particularly from an African perspective and a developing country perspective, is this notion of trying to kind of put development at the end of the spectrum versus trying to get graduating developing countries out of special and differential treatment using objective criteria. And this is part and parcel of what the US is proposing. And they're also now talking about creating punitive consequences for members who do not submit their notifications or if they do not comply with their notification obligations. Now, none of these are really new because in Trump's first administration, a number of these ideas were already tabled and debated, but they didn't move that much. But we're obviously seeing a much more kind of aggressive attitude and a very selective attitude by the US in terms of the interests that they have and how they want the WTO to function in the future. One interesting comment, and I'll end here, is around what the US has said when we talk about reform. So I mentioned that countries have different perspectives of what we want the WTO to be, what we want it to do, what we want it to serve. But the US made an interesting point, and they said that the WTO reform agenda does not necessarily mean that we should be expanding the WTO's functions, that we should be expanding the areas of work that the WTO should be presiding over. But maybe what we should be doing is doing things better. So whatever we are currently doing, how can we improve it? So as you can see, there's a lot of different interests, and there's also a large segment of developing countries who also hold very dearly the Doha Development Agenda, particularly not so much in name, but primarily the issues that were under reform for developing countries, such as agricultural domestic support, subsidies, food security, public stockholding issues. And the African group, for instance, have tabled a number of submissions laying out quite systematically what their interests are going into the ministerial conference.
You have given us so much to chew on, Vahini, so much there. But I wanted to ask you, a question about this reform, not the institutional, but in terms of credible outcomes. And I thought, let me just limit it to two things you have mentioned earlier. I mean, you talked about the WTO law on e-commerce. You also talked about TRIPS, and I mean, for our audience here, we know that electronic commerce is simply a means of buying and selling goods and services online. We do this through apps, through websites, through digital platforms. These create jobs for people, especially us in the unions, right? Because trading is moving online to decide who controls the data, who controls the digital markets, how do we set taxation, competition, cross-border services. We have also these digital services in AFTA. And this matters for us in the unions because of the future jobs, because of workers' rights in the digital economy, and whether countries can protect and grow in their own industry. So I want you to give me the WTO view now that a certain draft and the discussions that went on around the digital commerce, and then also a short one on TRIPS. TRIPS stands for Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights. Why is intellectual property rights so important and so crucial in WTO discussions? For me, access to medicine is very important. Patents can make drugs expensive, like you remember during COVID-19 debates. Technology access is another great one, and this is directly linked again to jobs and development. Can you give us your take on what went on at the WTO with these two big discussions on e-commerce and intellectual property rights, and what we in the unions should do about it?
Okay, so that's a lot. Okay, so maybe I should first start off by saying, so e-commerce in the WTO needs to be looked at in three, okay, at least coming out of the conference, there are now three separate issues that we are dealing with. So the first one is the multilateral agenda on electronic commerce, which is kind of housed under what we call the multilateral work program on electronic commerce, which is basically a very an exploratory but systematic process in which members can discuss e-commerce in the WTO. Now, it's been in existence since 1998. So this is a really long time, but it has not delivered a single recommendation. Now, in 1998, at the same time, under the Clinton administration, the US was advocating, it's really funny, in two little innocuous lines, they wanted language that we should insert in the work program to say that that members will continue not imposing customs duties on electronic transmissions. And so that kind of continued right up until this ministerial conference, except there were two ministerial conferences, which was Seattle and Cancun, in which the WTO meetings had collapsed and there was no continuation of this moratorium. And so this is now the third occasion at Yaoundé where it has not been agreed. Now, the biggest debate around this has been that the US is now advocating not for a 2-year temporary rollover, they are advocating for a permanent moratorium, meaning that countries must permanently kind of foreclose what we considered to be policy space that we were only rolling over every 2 years, but to permanently close it so that you will not be able to levy any duties. Now, what's really interesting from an African perspective is that in the AfCFTA Digital Trade Protocol, it's quite unprecedented, the language that we have in that protocol, where we say that we will not levy duties to African platforms. So there's a rules of origin provision in the Digital Trade Protocol in the African context. But it does not close or foreclose that possibility for African countries to levy duties to non-African platforms. So in a way, you could say that the multilateral WTO moratorium would kind of be closing the space that you had preserved for yourself in the AfCFTA context. So the Africa group was open to considering only a 2-year temporary moratorium. And I think as the negotiations had evolved at the conference and with the high political kind of dynamics that were going on, they were also open to the longer term moratorium. So just to say that even though the US went to the MC or to Yaoundé with this hardline position that they want a permanent moratorium and that they will not accept a 2-year, they eventually had softened to accept a longer term moratorium, which was essentially 5 years with a review to be done in the fourth year of the 5 years. Okay, so that's the one part. The second part is there is now a plurilateral agreement on electronic commerce, which proponents are going to be implementing as an interim arrangement outside the WTO. In that agreement, there is a permanent moratorium. Okay, so there's that dynamic. And now, when we had come out of the ministerial conference, about 2 to 3 days later, a group of countries, I think it's about 23 countries, if I'm not mistaken, had issued a joint statement basically saying that we, parties to the statement, agree not to levy duties against the countries to this agreement. So they are actually calling it a plurilateral arrangement, which is really quite unprecedented, I would say, in this context. And I think in some ways it's also going to build some level of pressure or maybe even coercion on countries who may not be too comfortable with agreeing to the moratorium to be put under pressure that they would have to either ease their positions and ultimately agree to a moratorium.
Mm.
So those are basically the dynamics we're dealing with. And maybe just the fourth one, I could add one last one, is that the US in their bilateral deals have also been securing a permanent moratorium. So when the US did not get this permanent moratorium at the MC14, one of the statements coming out of the USTR was that We knew that the WTO, is not capable of doing many things, and this was the most reasonable kind of expectation that we would renew this for workers, for American workers, and kind of all of those terms that they were using to support the American trade policy agenda. But then they also said that they have been securing it with their major trading partners. So, kind of saving face in a way to say that, well, we've secured it with our major trading partners, so we are not all that concerned that we haven't been able to secure it at the WTO, despite their maximalist position getting into the conference. Yeah, so that's kind of the context that we're working with. The big issue now is that an instruction has been given to countries to come back to Geneva and to try and see how we are going to resolve this issue between the TRIPS non-violation and situation complaints moratorium and the e-commerce one. So I think that's really the big question mark about how we are going to deal with it. And now just coming to the TRIPS issue. I think I mentioned this just a few moments before about historically, these two have been linked. So if e-commerce gets renewed for 2 years, then the TRIPS non-violation moratorium also gets linked and then it gets renewed. But one of the major challenges that we have is that developing countries really, it's not a question of like the e-commerce moratorium, there are clear beneficiaries of that moratorium where it's really platform economies, big tech companies, a lot of there's a clear kind of divide in terms of if you are a net exporter of electronic transmissions, then you greatly benefit from this moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions. But with the TRIPS non-violation and situation complaints moratorium, it's a little different because it's a moratorium that I would say all developing countries benefit from. And so I think it was really concerning for a number of reasons why the lapse of the TRIPS moratorium has what I would say been uh, would have a negative impact for developing countries, primarily because it will create a chilling effect on public health flexibilities. So the TRIPS agreement explicitly permits compulsory licensing,
Mm,
parallel importation, and also other flexibilities that developing countries use to access affordable medicines. But without the
mm,
moratorium, a developed country could now bring a non-violation complaint arguing that a compulsory license, while technically legal, nullifies or impairs the commercial benefits that country expected from the agreement. So
mm,
the mere
mm,
threat that such a complaint would deter governments from using the flexibilities they are basically legally entitled to would be quite a worrying development.
mm,
Another quite glaring issue, and this is something that you had mentioned earlier in your opening, was the importance of policy space. And this non-violation and situations complaints, it basically allows a member to challenge another's country's measures, even when that measure breaks no rule. So any kind of like domestic regulation touching intellectual property from data sovereignty rules to technology transfer requirements to educational use exceptions becomes potentially actionable if a trading partner claims it impairs their expected benefits from the agreement. So
mm,
for developing countries trying to build technology bases, if they are trying to regulate digital platforms and even manage access to knowledge, this turns kind of compliant policy making into litigation risks.
mm,
And of course, there's also the big questions around, users of litigation or dispute settlement in the WTO. And in a sense, it's going to kind of weaponize this asymmetry that we see with litigation, where
right.
if you bring a non-violation complaint, it's complex, it's expensive, um, you know, um, more so developed countries and their IP intensive industries have the legal infrastructure to basically mount these cases. But most
Mm,
African countries, LDC members, don't have this capacity to defend them. And so
right.
this moratorium lapsing kind of effectively hands a new enforcement tool to those who least need it and points it at those least equipped to respond. And just finally, maybe I should just mention, which I should have mentioned earlier, was one of the bigger concerning things with the developments around electronic commerce in the WTO is that the plurilateral agreement on e-commerce is much more expansive in the sense that it's also covering digital trade. So you mentioned e-commerce is about buying things online, but the e-commerce agreement, even though it's called the AEC, the Agreement on Electronic Commerce, has a number of digital trade provisions, which is interesting because in the AFCFTA context, we call it a digital trade protocol, and it has both digital trade and e-commerce provisions. But this one doesn't. So on name, it's just e-commerce, but the provisions itself extend far beyond e-commerce.
Thanks for that. And I mean, you started with this is a rule-based system or a power-based system, and now we are hearing about all the entanglement at the WTO with the e-commerce and trips. Thanks for those insights. We'll go very soon to our audience to ask you some questions, and we'll take it from there. But I still have a couple of questions for you before we go to our audience. We have just talked about digital trade and the trips, etc. But we know on the continent, we largely export raw materials,
Yeah.
right? In terms of the global supply chain, we don't have so much, we don't get so much value. Some estimates say we only get some 2% to up to 5% tops of global, supply chain value. So how do the ministerial outcomes affect Africa's ability to reverse the raw material export trap and move into processing, into manufacturing, into higher value segments of global value chains? And most importantly, a top-up question there would be, do the Yaoundé outcomes really create pathways for integrating labor rights, integrating ILO labor standards into WTO rules? What would be your take on that as an expert in the field?
Wow. So we left Yaoundé with a very, I mean, even if you want to call it a package, it was really very minimalist in nature. And the straightforward answer would be that no, the ministerial outcomes did not reverse this raw material export trap. So, I mean, the conclusion here would be that MC14 provided no support for structural transformation. And it left the structural obstacles largely intact. And and I think this maybe gives me an opportunity to give you a sense of what the African group has been advocating for. And the African group is a group of 45 WTO members. And they come together and they develop joint submissions. They have joint negotiating proposals, joint negotiating positions as well. And there were a number of important positions that they had, particularly on this issue regarding policy space for structural transformation. But also, more importantly, it's kind of elevated, or no, it's kind of evolved into also addressing the green transition. So, one of the first issues that they have been pointing out in a number of their submissions relates to, for instance, tariff escalation. So, in agriculture, the Africa Group have been quite active in the agriculture negotiations, where they were calling for a dedicated work program to address tariff peaks and also tariff escalation affecting key African exports. Okay, but obviously there was no program that was established because the agriculture negotiations had collapsed. But this was really an issue where for the Africa group, tariff escalation would be something where the processed goods face higher tariffs than raw commodities. So it would be a direct tax on Africa's industrialization. And so this was one of the issues that they were trying to address. Another issue also relates to technology access. So the Africa group had a WTO reform paper where they were identifying kind of like the asymmetries in technology diffusion, including technologies essential for diversification. And one important proposal was in the context of the TRIPS Article 66.2, which was basically a binding obligation on developed countries to provide incentives for technology transfer to LDCs. But unfortunately, the way the drafting of the language for the decision was such that it was voluntary and it was basically non-functional. And the LDCs had proposed an illustrative voluntary list, but there was no progress that was made at MC14. So here again, it's just kind of showing you that the MC14 did not deliver on many of these issues. Another big one is also in relation to specifically WTO reform, where there were a number of tracks. So it was basically three tracks that members were deliberating on, and this relates to SNDT and development, decision making, and the third one, and I think probably the most important, was on the level playing field track. Now, this agenda was primarily being advanced by the EU in the context of WTO reform going into Yaoundé, and to some extent the US, because they were basically trying to target industrial subsidies and state intervention. But historically, level playing field is actually a term used by the global south. So in the early 2000s, it was a term that developing countries and least developed countries were using in the WTO to try to redress the asymmetries in the system. And a lot of this related to, for instance, about 7 to 8 years ago, the Africa Group started tabling a number of papers relating to policy space, where they were also targeting subsidies issues, trips, local content, etc. And in some ways, and I've said this before, the African Group agenda on policy space was essentially hijacked. And it's basically now become an agenda about industrial subsidies and how do we reopen the WTO agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures, to try and either repurpose subsidies or to create some kind of policy space for all countries. And probably, and I say all probably in a bit of a sarcastic way, because it was primarily to benefit those who have the fiscal capacity to give subsidies, but also big questions around whether reopening this agreement is going to cause even more asymmetries than they can resolve. And so, just coming back, I mean, African countries have argued for a number of years that they would lose the tools that every currently industrialized economy has used in its own development phase. And the African Group have a number of papers where they talk about how they want to move up the value chain, and that how the current system is basically reinforcing their commodity dependence, and that the tariff structures, or at least the tariff structure acts as a tax on Africa's industrialization. And so this is something that needs to be done. There have been attempts by the WTO to do something. So there is the Cotton Initiative. I mean, I'm a little skeptical about it because there's not a lot of transparency around it. But the Afri-Exim Bank has kind of launched a new phase of this Cotton Initiative where they're trying to move cotton to textile and garment value chain. It's basically just a financing mechanism. It's not really something that you would consider to be an outcome of the WTO, but it does represent probably a practical effort to build the value chain that WTO outcomes have consistently failed to support. Yeah, I mean, maybe I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. You've given us a lot of insights, and I'm happy to hear that the African Group is working together, putting together joint proposals, putting together joint negotiation strategies, joint papers, at least to advance what it is that Africa has been losing out all these years, and advancing to push and make sure we are in those policy spaces for structural transformation. That's what Africa really needs. So happy to hear at least some of those initiatives by the African Group, especially with technology access that you talked about. And yes, the issue about the tariff structure and how we are still forced to export raw materials, these commodities, I think that is one of Africa's biggest problems, and it's a pity. It's a pity that this WTO 14 ministerial could not address any of that. Colleagues, here will be opening, up for your questions shortly. I have seen questions in the forum. I highly recommend that you put your questions in the forum so we can take as many questions as possible, and then we can do voice and open up for one or two colleagues. I've already seen a hand to ask their questions directly. Finally, Vahini from me. I think I'm trying to be an optimist here, but everything I hear is not working. It's not working. The MC14 did not deliver. Therefore, I was going to ask about, what AFTA's leverage could be, and you have talked a little bit about that with the digital trade protocol, for example. But who stands to benefit from these current WTO directions or global trade in general? Just be frank with us here. Who stands to benefit? And pitch this against ordinary workers in Africa. And after you have done that, advise us on how African trade unions can strategically engage at the national, at the regional, and at the global levels. How do we come in? How should we engage? How should we contribute to finding a solution, which you have described is a gargantuan problem that we don't know how to access? But tell us, who is benefiting and how do we engage?
So, I think it would be sector specific. So maybe if I had to pick a sector, so if we have to talk about digital, for instance, and kind of the conversations going on around a permanent moratorium on customs duties on electronic transmissions, and also alongside the plurilateral agreement on electronic commerce. I would say that um, the current direction, um, above all, is really the large platform companies and digital services exporters of advanced economies who are really the key players who stand to benefit from these rules. So, for instance, if we look at the agreement on electronic commerce, it's going to be implemented by, I think, 51 members, or just, yeah, 51 or 52 members. So it's locking in a permanent prohibition on customs duties on electronic transmissions. It's creating transparency and regulatory certainty obligations for digital services. It's extending the framework to countries that account for the majority of global digital trade. Although I should say that the US has not joined this agreement. So that's also an interesting development, because about 3 to 4 years ago, under Biden's administration, the US had indicated that they themselves need policy space, so that they had also kind of reassessed their own position in this agreement. And if you have to kind of look at that side by side with, for instance, the context of African workers and economies, they are for the most part consumers and not producers of the digital products and of the services covered by these rules or by this agreement. So the digital divide kind of means that African MSMEs have limited ability to access digital trade opportunities, while large foreign platforms access African markets on terms that they help negotiate. So I could also give you another example. In the peak of the negotiations in the AfCFTA Digital Trade Protocol, when those negotiations were happening in Accra, the US AID had pledged 160 million US dollars for the implementation of the AfCFTA digital trade and investment protocols. Now, why is the US pledging support for the implementation of these agreements? I mean, I was in some of those meetings, and big platform companies were invited to these brainstorming meetings that the AfCFTA were having. So there was already a big presumption of the role that big foreign tech firms were having and the influence that they were having on the rules that African countries were negotiating. So this kind of gives you a sense also of this kind of power dynamics that's happening behind the scenes, trying to drive some of these decisions and drive some of what these rules are starting to look like. But if we have to kind of bring it back to the WTO and particularly under the multilateral work program on e-commerce and the African group's priorities, I mean, they've called specifically for bridging the digital divide. They've spoken about boosting digital infrastructure. One of their submissions, they want to address anti-competitive digital trade practices and technology transfer. They are seeking a clear framework to support all WTO members to benefit equitably from e-commerce. But none of these have really appeared in the e-commerce agreement or the interim arrangement. There were also I'm not sure if this is the right platform to say, but when a handful of African countries were participating in the plurilateral negotiations on e-commerce, African countries, I mean, I know delegates who have told me their own experiences in the negotiations. They were prevented from tabling submissions because they were trying to insert that kind of very pro-development kind of pro MSME kind of dynamics into the agreements. And they were not only prevented from tabling submissions, but if they did succeed in tabling a submission in the negotiations, it was decided by the co-facilitators how much airtime their proposals will have in the negotiations. So they could be cut off, you wouldn't really have much engagement on your proposal because it was serving a particular agenda. So that's just one kind of example. But also, if I had to be a little bit more specific, if we're now looking kind of honing down on the labor consequences, it's generally been concentrated in a few areas. So there's platform workers, for instance, where platform companies kind of operate under many frameworks that have been negotiated in Geneva or in other places without the participation of African labor movements. The e-commerce agreement, if I remember correctly, because it has undergone a revision since the last time I had assessed it, the consumer protection provisions are also quite weak relative to the regulatory needs of workers in kind of gig economy context, and its data protection provisions don't address some of the issues that we are now seeing become very serious, like the algorithmic management of labor rights. Oh yes, and maybe I should also mention something really important. The African group had a really interesting submission on remittances
Okay.
that they had wanted to take, that they had taken to the ministerial conference, and there was no consensus, where they were championing a political mandate for the WTO to reduce the costs of remittances.
Mm.
And, I think, and I stand to be corrected, but this was really a proposal that the entire global South had supported. And I understand that the EU was also to some extent quite supportive of it, but it was the US and the UK, given their big financial financial companies who would stand to, I guess, lose from bank charges and things, because these were conversations that were taking place in the WTO Council meetings. And so, that's just another example of proposals that don't really see the light of day in the WTO. But more specifically on digital remittance transfers, they increasingly operating through the same channels that are covered by the moratorium.
Mm.
So this lapse of the moratorium and also the failure to agree to the declaration on remittances in Yaoundé also kind of creates like a vacuum of sorts that affects the real incomes of migrant workers and their families. And the whole point of the submission was really to give some effect to the Sustainable Development Goal target of reducing remittance transfer costs to below 3%.
Yeah.
Another issue on the labor aspects is probably the fiscal space for labor protection. So, governments cannot tax digital transactions. Or governments that cannot tax digital transactions will essentially lose revenue that could fund a number of issues. For instance, the African group had argued in the past that they could use money from the moratorium, if it was not agreed, to finance their own digital transformation. But in addition to that, it could also fund social protection, maybe even labor market regulation and
mm,
skills development. And so this
mm,
permanent customs duty prohibition in the e-commerce agreement also forecloses this fiscal option for African countries that join and create pressure on those outside the agreement to maintain the same practice voluntarily.
mm,
And probably lastly, the WTO's preamble in the Marrakesh Agreement makes specific reference to raising the living standards, and there's also a reference to full employment. And I think the most important protection needed is not really about like defending existing platform workers, but about creating the conditions for African digital industries to develop. And I think this is a conversation that's sorely lacking in this context, when we're discussing trade policy and we're talking about trade rules, because technology transfer obligations are important. Data sovereignty rights are critical. The ability to use regulatory frameworks that prefer domestic digital content and services as industrial policy instruments are quite fundamental to the structural transformation of Africa. And so the way we're seeing this e-commerce agreement and the current architecture, it's not really providing this kind of bottom up development kind of perspective to implement and
mm,
to kind of, in a way, reclaim some policy space in a market that many of our countries are really going to struggle to not only get into, but integrate. And the South Center has actually, we've done a mapping paper where we compared the plurilateral agreement on electronic commerce alongside the AFCFTA, digital trade protocol. And it just kind of shows how different the objectives have been with both agreements and kind of the policy orientation that the AFCFTA protocol takes
mm,
versus the policy and the market orientation that the WTO plurilateral agreement on e-commerce takes.
mm. Thank you so much, Vahini, for those pieces of, I would say, analytics and recommendations, very straight and direct on the money. We will now turn to the audience who have been listening and have seen conversations ongoing in the chats and questions. So I know some of these questions are long enough to write a full doctoral thesis on, but try to just summarize it in a minute for each question. So let me ask the first three or four, so you can just take notes. So the first one is from Rafayette Ula. This question says, would you please tell us about LDC package in the 14th WTO summit at Yaoundé, because many LDCs said for continuation of different trade tariffs, particularly by the graduating LDCs, even after their graduation. I hope I don't know, you understand this question. Okay, I think I read it from the bottom. There is another one on the platform that is coming from Raymond Sane. Has there been any discussion about the TFA, which has not been evaluated since its beginning, that is 9 years ago? And the second question, where are the different position papers available? In other words, where can we find them? There is a question from Arsène Obut that I have translated here. If you know that there is no industry without raw materials, and that these raw materials come from Africa, it is unfortunate to observe that tariffs under the AFCFTA are relatively high compared to those in industrialized countries. Can we therefore say that the WTO is complicit in the imbalance faced by AFCFTA countries? Then last
Um,
one,
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
yeah, so if we know that there is no industry without raw materials and that these raw materials come from Africa, it is then unfortunate to observe that tariffs under the AFCFTA are relatively high compared to those in industrialized countries. Can we therefore say that the WTO is complicit in the imbalance faced by AFCFTA countries? Then the last one here, it says, this is Aline Asankbon, journalist from Benin. The question here is, how can Benin implement concrete actions within the framework of AFCFTA to promote the local structural transformation of cotton in textile products and derive greater benefit from it? When you're done with that, then we go on online. I see Comrade Trenton's hand.
Okay, I am not sure if I captured everything, but let me start with what I can recall. Um, okay, so there's a question about the LDC package and what was it? Um, so the LDC specific package for MC14 was basically submitted by the LDC coordinator, who is currently the Gambia. And if I recall correctly, there were four core requests that the LDC group have made, which we call, to be under a so-called LDC package, which is still to be agreed and has been moved back to Geneva. So we hope something positive will come out of that. The first one is a very long-standing item, which relates to graduating LDCs. So the LDC group have basically been trying across very specific WTO agreements over time to seek a commitment from WTO members for the smooth transition of measures for LDCs who are graduating. For instance, members that graduate from LDC status should continue benefiting from key flexibilities for X number of years. And if I'm not mistaken, the number that they had put was 3 years. And this was specifically under the agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures. I mentioned the TRIPS Article 66.2, which is a provision for developed countries to provide incentives for technology transfer to LDCs, and also on agriculture, and I think it was export competition. So there's a provision in the agreement on export competition in which they are seeking a longer period for LDC graduating countries. Another is also in relation to past decisions that have been taken on LDC specific commitments or decisions in the WTO. So at the 12th Ministerial Conference in Geneva and the 13th Ministerial Conference in Abu Dhabi, there were certain commitments that were taken regarding the operationalization of decisions previously taken in favor of LDCs. And so, the LDC group is basically looking for a reaffirmation of instructions. This is mostly political and not extremely substantive in nature. The other is also very important because this is an agenda that is also related to what the group of 90 countries are interested in, and that is the ACP group, the LDC group, and the African group. And they're basically looking for progress on non-binding illustrative lists of incentives to implement your TRIPS Article 66.2 obligations, but also with a commitment that further discussion would move to the Council for TRIPS. Now, this issue is getting rather political because in the US submission, the US has actually called for the body, which is the Committee on Trade and Development in special session that is mandated to deal with this particular agenda. The US is calling for this body to close, and they're also calling for the mandate to make precise, effective, and operational under paragraph 44 of the Doha Ministerial Declaration to come to an end. So the US says that this mandate has been fulfilled, which it hasn't, but they don't want to deal with it, and that discussions have been exhausted. And finally, the LDC package, and I think this is one of the most important ones, is a reaffirmation of the enhanced integrated framework, which is basically the only multilateral aid for trade mechanism dedicated to LDCs, and to also welcome the launch of its next phase, and urging partners to secure adequate financing. So that's pretty much the LDC package. All of the submissions, including the African group submissions and whatever's been tabled to the ministerial conference, is available on the WTO website. So if you go to look for WTO MC14, there is a little tab that says all MC14 documents. And if you just scroll down, there's probably about, I don't know, 70 or 80 papers that have been submitted by a range of members. You'll be able to find the specific submissions that the Africa Group, LDC Group, individual developing countries, etc., have tabled or submitted to the conference. But a distinction has to be made between a proposal that has been submitted to the conference, which is basically just part of a list on the website, or a list of submissions that have formed part of the package that ministers will basically be looking at. So if it's not in the package, and this was a really important procedural question that members were dealing with in the lead up to MC14, in which there was some thoughts amongst members that they wanted their submissions to be put in front of ministers and not chair texts. So what some of the chairs do, depending on the nature of the discussions or the negotiations, kind of under their own responsibility, develop what they see to be a landing zone that ministers should look at based on varying positions and interests. I think there was a question about the TFA, about the Trade Facilitation Agreement, and I'm not sure if I had understood it properly, but basically, yes, the TFA had entered into force many years ago, and despite it being kind of like the only multilateral agreement concluded, well, now it's the fish agreement as well, but before that, it was the only multilateral agreement concluded since the WTO's creation, has not really undergone a comprehensive, independent evaluation of its development impact. And so the small economies decision at MC14 actually touches on this indirectly by instructing work on trade logistics, connectivity, and I think it's border processes, but a full TFA review, particularly on assessing whether the promised technical assistance and capacity building commitments have actually been delivered to developing countries and LDCs, has not been done. And I think this is long overdue, and it should be part of the post MC14 reform agenda. Did I miss anything?
And then the ones on after and the raw materials question.
Sorry, can you remind me again?
Yes, talking about whether the WTO is complicit in this imbalance faced by AFTA countries in terms of this raw materials pricing when it comes to exports.
Oh,
And then
okay.
the one from Benin also is linked to the AFTA. How can Benin implement concrete actions within the framework of AFTA to promote local structural transformation on say, cotton?
Oh, wow. Okay. I'm not sure I can answer this one about Benin. But the particular question regarding whether the WTO is complicit, I mean, I think we just need to have a better understanding about the the ability of the WTO to do certain things and its ability or its incapacity to be able to do things. I mean, I think we've had many conversations with our members and in dialogues and things about whether the WTO is a development organization or not. And there's obviously big questions about how we as developing countries view this organization and what it has done or what it hasn't done for us. But I think the baseline generally is the WTO in terms of how it defines many of our countries' engagements in other forums, including the AFCFTA. I was once on a panel where somebody questioned why was the African group championing special and differential treatment in TRIMS, like why do they want to reopen the TRIMS agreement or the TRIPS agreement when we have the AFCFTA? And for me, that kind of is a bit of a fundamental misunderstanding of the WTO because a lot of the baseline commitments and a lot of the policy space that developing countries have given up have been primarily because of the multilateral rules that we have taken in the multilateral trading system, which is binding international economic law, in which you can be taken to dispute if you do not comply. And so, in many ways, what you agree to at the WTO does already narrow the policy space available for you to negotiate further. Of course, there are exceptions to MFN, like Article 24, etc., to have these FTAs and all of that. But I think to some extent, yes, the WTO has been complicit in many of these things. And I think this comes back to the first question you asked me about what happened in Yaoundé. And one of my first kind of reflections was about how out of touch with reality the ministerial conference really was, because we were talking about what to discuss when we come back to Geneva and not about the real things that were really impacting countries, like the unilateral measures, like the CBAM and the unilateral protectionist measures in the name of climate change or the green transition or carbon leakage or whatever. We weren't talking about the war. We weren't talking about the energy crisis. We weren't talking about food insecurity. We were just talking about what should the committee be talking about for the next few years. And so I felt like it is really an organization that is struggling. And it is up to us to try to make it relevant. And I think trade unions offer quite an interesting perspective, particularly given the constituencies that you serve, to try to some extent to work with your governments and to work and create some mobilization at the multilateral level to create some of this pressure the way big industry is able to do so.
Some wisdom there. Thank you so much.